Professor Monroe again, and in this video we'll be talking about the ethical theory of act utilitarianism. The focus of act utilitarianism is on situational decision making. Now that sounds obvious, and it's actually implied by the name, act utilitarianism, but the main concern here for this theory isn't so much what kind of social rules that we might need for an organized society or on an individual's personal character, but rather the focus is on how ought I to act in this particular circumstance. So if you're confronted with some kind of moral quandary, how would you go about solving it to get a nice, well thought out ethical solution? That's really the primary focus of the act utilitarian. Well, according to act utilitarians, what we ought to do is if we have one of those dark, sleepless ethical nights of the soul and we have a decision to make, is to apply the utility principle on a case-by-case basis. You may recall the utility principle from a previous video, but it says the right action is the one that tends to produce the greatest possible balance of happiness over unhappiness for the greatest possible number. That is to say, the option that produces the most net utility is the right option that we should act on. Not in just this circumstance, but in any circumstance. So whenever I have an ethical decision to make of any sort whatsoever, whether or not to cheat on my taxes, whether or not to stop at a stoplight, whether or not to help a little old lady across the street, what I ought to do is think about the happiness or unhappiness that action is likely to produce, and then choose a solution that makes the most people happy. Right? So the right action is the one that tends to produce the greatest possible balance of happiness over unhappiness for the greatest possible number, and apply that on a case-by-case basis. Notice that the rightness or wrongness of any action, or anything that you decide to do, is a function purely of the outcome, how much happiness or unhappiness is produced. Other guidelines, like laws and rules, are nice to have, but it's important to note that from the act utilitarian's standpoint, those are always superseded by the utility principle. So your boss at work might have a rule about X, whatever X happens to be, but if that rule about X contradicts what the greatest happiness principle or utility principle asks you to do, then you ought to go with what the utility principle says. That's the ultimate decider of questions of right and wrong. So here's a simple example. Imagine an expectant mother who's driving with the father of her soon-to-be-born child to the hospital in the middle of the night. The baby's on its way, it's about to come, and they need to be at the hospital immediately. And along the way, they catch a red light. There's no one else at the stoplight, there's no other traffic on the road. What should they do? Should they sit and obey the traffic signal, or should they keep going to the hospital? Well, the act utilitarian would argue that on the basis of the utility principle, they ought to run the stoplight. More people are made happy by that decision than made unhappy. The father's happy, the mother's happy, the hospital staff is probably happy. They get to deliver this beautiful new child into the world, but nobody's made unhappy by that, so the right thing to do in that case is to break the law. Now, yes, it's illegal to do that, but the act utilitarian would say, look, the morally right thing or the morally correct thing here would be to break the law. So there's a distinction between what's legally right and what's morally right according to the act utilitarian, and the final decider of what's morally right is that utility principle. There are some problems with this theory that it's worth us thinking about. The first is that the theory is essentially predictive. It asks us to make forecasts about the future and how things are likely to turn out. We don't know for certain that things will actually turn out that way, so in a way we're making our best, most reasonable guess about how things are likely to go. But we've probably all experienced it at some point in life where we've made a decision about some problem that we've had, thinking it's going to go one way, only to have it go a completely different way, much to our deep, deep chagrin. This problem of predictability is a problem for all consequentialist theories, and act utilitarianism is no exception. We're very bad about forecasting long-term outcomes, and sometimes that goes to our detriment. The question then becomes, how useful is this theory if we really can't make these predictions in the first place? Another problem with this theory is sort of the essential assumption that pleasure and pain are the sorts of things that you can measure and predict to begin with. Pleasures and pains are private mental states. That is, our happiness or our unhappiness are things that only we directly experience. But the theory would have it that we can observe and predict and measure and forecast this very phenomenon, this fact of happiness or unhappiness. But it doesn't seem like these are the sorts of things that you can measure or predict with any kind of regular accuracy. And we vary so widely concerning the things that make us happy or unhappy, it's almost a non-starter to think that it can be done. For example, You may very well enjoy NASCAR races, and I may hate them. You might be really happy at watching the cars race around the track, whereas I'm internally miserable. So who's got the right of that? And how will we ever know how to predict who'd be happy or unhappy on that basis? Another thing that bothers people about act utilitarianism is that there doesn't seem to be any moral absolutes. There are no absolute right or wrongs. If rightness or wrongness is a function of how much happiness an action produces, that means actions are always going to be more or less right or wrong and never absolutely right or wrong. So any action that you might think of, like murder, lying, stealing, torture, are potentially morally permissible on this view if those actions promote the greater balance of happiness. Some ethicists find that a strange notion that an ethical theory would be capable of justifying things like murder, torture, etc., and that gives them pause and great concern. Our next video will focus on how to apply act utilitarianism to an actual moral problem. You got a little taste of what it's about here, but we'll go through Karina's dilemma.